Hello again, commentary fans. This is Mike here again, and today we're going to be revisiting the classic monsters. Today we're doing House of Frankenstein, the 1944 follow up to one of the first shows we did, Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. And I was thinking about what to do, and just looking at the likes and the views, it seems that my most popular commentary was the Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman commentary. And so I was thinking that this would be a pretty good follow up and a treat to those that have viewed my videos and liked them. I really hope you guys dig this commentary. I am watching the VHS edition, believe it or not, the Universal Classic, Monster Studios Classic Collection, those great tapes that came out in the 90s, and I can't think of a better way to relive that nostalgia. I am stopped on the Universal logo, and I'm going to start the picture in 3, 2, and 1. 3, 2, and 1. The Universal picture with that spinning globe around. And this movie was originally intended to end it all. And the only reason it didn't was because it was such a huge success. But House of Frankenstein takes a look at all the success that Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman had and says, why not try to up it? Why not try to give our fans something to really go out with a bang on? And it features Boris Karloff, who I think is the best thing about this picture. He had been away, I think, since about 1940. He hadn't done any Universal pictures. I believe the last one he did before this was Black Friday, which was a pretty awful picture he did with Lugosi. But he's back here as Dr. Gustav Niemann, a mad scientist. And we're introduced to Professor Lampini's wagon of horrors as it passes by this old dungeon. And really, this is the best sequence in the movie. As we're going to go into, I think the director of this film, Earl Kenton, he was kind of a journeyman director, and he wasn't able really to give the same mythos to these monster pictures as Roy William Neill or George Wagner did in the 40s. But this opening is fantastic. Karloff's great in it. He reaches for the jailer's throat. He wants his chalk. Karloff was away from pictures for a while. This was sort of a comeback for him. He was in Arsenic and Old Lace, which was that great macabre farce that was on Broadway. And this marked his return, and he went back to Universal, and this is what they cast him in. And it's a brilliant plan to give the fans what they want, to bring back the father of horror. Oh, I love this set here of all these macabre drawings that he's drawn on his the wall of his prison cell with his chalk. And he has no students, so he teaches his friend Daniel, who just kind of absorbs what he says because he's so lonely there. And Daniel is J. Carrol Naish, who was a popular character actor. appeared in a number of films, but I think this is my favorite role with him in it. He plays the hunchback Daniel, who's so tragic and so sad. He goes over a pretty. I think he's a character that changes the most over the film and really is the most interesting in terms of how they develop. And here, like, he just told his jailer that he would never get out, or that as soon as he get out, he get revenge, and then it's like less than 2 minutes later, the whole dungeon caves in. Talk about that for convenience. But this is a great opening shot. Karloff looks like hell here. Jack Pierce really does a good job with that makeup there. And I think the reason I like Karloff the best in this film is that Karloff had the ability to be pretty versatile in what he brought to a character. You know, obviously when you think of Karloff, he very much has that gentlemanly quality, you know, this prim and proper Englishman. But, you know, like, he would play these wild men characters, and I like in this film that he sort of does both here. We get to see him as the wild man here. Here we are helping Professor Lampini, who is played by George Zucco, and they're bringing his wagon out of the mud. You think the people here would be a little hesitant to trust Neiman and Daniel after they know that prison completely got exploded by lightning. But it's good stuff. This opening is very good, very atmospheric. Professor Lampini, A Doubting World, the actual skeleton of Count Dracula. Cries of fake, fake. Lampini took it. We're led to believe that he actually took the skeleton from the Carpathian Mountains, and here he is sort of giving a re-education, if you will, of the Dracula myth. And one thing I really think that's pretty weak about this picture is that Dracula in it. And if you've been good enough to follow me all this time, you know that I love Dracula. He's probably my favorite monster. I go off and on, but Dracula pretty much consistently is my favorite monster. And here, I think, is one of the really weaker interpretations of the character. We'll go into that when we are introduced to Dracula himself. But just the idea that this snake oil salesman is able to find Dracula's final resting place is kind of goofy. It stretches believability a little bit. But, you know, going into House of Frankenstein, you have to realize that this is a very different horror film. Here we have a very good scare coming up. Yeah, this beginning is really the most terrifying. This shot of J. Carrol Naish as Daniel moving into the Zuko's face to strangle him to death. That's dark and very, very frightening. And I like the way Karloff just quietly says, the driver. You know, he's cold-blooded here. you, it's kind of, this scene is funny. You see how quickly they changed, and so we shall hide, but in the open. I love that line. Karloff, unloving memories. They do a good job here of kind of showing how they take up the stage show, and how Karloff becomes the new Lampini, and how he wants to move the show to all the places where he's been wronged, so he can murder everyone who's gotten his way. Here we have old Lionel Atwill as another inspector. I forget the name of this inspector because Lionel Atwill's inspectors all kind of run together for me, besides Inspector Krogh from Son of Frankenstein. But Lionel Atwill, at this point in his career, was in the middle of a pretty nasty sex scandal. Apparently, you know, there was an orgy at his house with where he had boys there, and they were watching his own personal pornographic films. And at this point in his career, Lionel Atwill had pretty much lost all the respectability he had, and fortunately for him, he was still able to get roles in these Universal monster films. And you know, you definitely see that the characters he gets in this one and in the next picture, House of Dracula, are just pretty thankless caricatures. They don't have any of the menace that the character had before, you know. Or, you know, not even the menace you saw in Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. He played that mayor. He was kind, you know, but he definitely had more of a character to him. His husband here reminds me kind of Ricky Ricardo. He definitely, I would say it was an impersonation, had not that this had come out before. And here's Neiman as Lampini, putting on the show of Count Dracula. And the stake is in his heart. And, you know, I wonder what Dracula that this is supposed to be, or if, you know, Universal expected us to believe that this was the same Dracula from the Lugosi film. You know, these films leave a lot to be desired in terms of the continuity of, you know, from the ones preceding it. Dracula didn't work as a series for Universal the same way that Frankenstein or the Wolfman did. Dracula had a sequel called Dracula's Daughter, which was it was an interesting film, but it was very kind of controversial. There was a lot of sexual undertones to the plot, and it didn't really have the same I don't know, it didn't have Bela Lugosi, I would say would be the main reason that it wasn't a huge success. But it's interesting. I definitely would recommend giving it a view because it does have a strong female character that I think is pretty is a good counterpoint to the traditional vampire legend. She's strong. She isn't a piece of property like so many female vampire characters, and that's a good one. But it wasn't a hit, so they didn't really want to continue it. Son of Dracula was another sequel, which I think is pretty good. A lot of people don't like Son of Dracula because they don't think Lon Chaney Jr. is a very good Count. And it's definitely miscasting, but I think he's does much better work as the Count than John Carradine, who we just saw resurrected. I got to imagine that filmgoers who went to see this movie in 1944, they expect this grand monster fest, and instead they're treated, they have all their favorites. You have Karloff, Lon Chaney Jr., and they advertise Dracula, but I gotta imagine that seeing that skeleton morph into John Carradine instead of Bela Lugosi was a huge disappointment. And here we have the stupidest motivation for Dracula ever. Karloff says, "If you do what I want, I will keep a safe refuge for my coffin." And Carradine comes up with the big gooey eyes and says, "Oh, for that, I will do anything." I mean, what the hell? Dracula, just when the character is done as he should be, he would be able to rip him to pieces, his mind to pieces, just stare that Neiman in the eye and, get rid of that. I'll keep my own coffin safe, thank you very much. But, these movies were definitely B-movies. They were smaller films in terms of budget and just time limitation. And so they wanted to fit in Dracula. And so they gave him the really cheap motivation here. And as we see, less than an hour, he has his own coachman. He's fitted in a new suit and cape and a new top hat, and he's posing as Baron Latos. Talk about rushed. And, I'm sounding like I'm complaining here, and I'm not, but I really think that this film should have been just have been Frankenstein meets the Wolfman 2, because we see that the Dracula subplot really does nothing other than to add Dracula and add marquee value to the picture. And I think it would have been a hell of a lot better and a hell of a lot more entertaining had they gotten Bela Lugosi to do the part. I just don't see why he wasn't. I have heard rumors. There's nothing really concrete about why they didn't bring Lugosi back here. What I've heard is that Universal was really, really displeased with what he did in Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. And, I don't claim to be a film historian. I'm just passing on what I've heard, but I really think that's unfair. You know me. If you've listened to me this far, you know that there's nothing I like better than to champion poor Bela Lugosi and his reputation. I'd love to go back in time and say, hey, stop treating this guy like garbage. If that was the reason, it's entirely Universal's fault, because they had edited Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman to the point where Lugosi's performance was that awkward thing. But Lugosi at this time was doing the Poverty Row pictures that we know and love, like The Devil Bat, that kind of thing, and so he wasn't in here. But he would have certainly been more interesting than John Carradine. John Carradine was an interesting fellow. He eventually had the same sort of downfall that Lon Jr. did. Lugosi certainly had it the worst, but Carradine was a respected actor, character actor, who, he had the same sort of hard living. He was an alcoholic, the same way that Chaney Jr. was, where his drinking became a liability, and he was forced to take horror film parts, and he lived longer than any of the main stars of these Universal films, although I wouldn't be as generous to call him a star of them. But Carradine did a number of interviews. He would talk about these films, and he didn't have the nicest things to say about them, and he kind of exaggerated to make himself look better. I know one story that goes on about his participation in this film is that he says that he hated the script for this movie, and he said, we should do a straight-up adaptation of Bram Stoker's original novel. And, anyone with half a brain would know that. Well, not half a brain, but anyone that knows anything about this sort of story, sort of the story about how these films were produced, would know that that was kind of goofy, and that wasn't true. And so, that's the story of why he wears mustache in this film, because Stoker described Dracula as having that mustache. But Carradine appeared in a number of really, really terrible horror films. He was definitely a star of the kind of drive-in schlock that you would see in the 60s and 70s. He even made it to the 80s, where he's in The Howling, and he looks like he's on the verge of death in that film. He's only in it because Joe Dante really kind of was enamored with him, I guess. He played Dracula again in Billy the Kid versus Dracula. But Carradine, not a very good Dracula in my estimation. He doesn't have, what I don't think he has? He doesn't have that romantic quality to the part. He has a aura of mystery. He certainly seems mysterious, and he kind of has a sinister edge, and his eyes are very expressive, but he isn't imposing at all, I don't think. And he doesn't have the romantic quality. And that's not to say that you need it, but that's not to say that you need that in order to successfully play Dracula, because, Christopher Lee didn't have that very much, neither did Lon Jr. in Son of Dracula. But in order to keep the character interesting, in terms of this really weak script and motivation, I think you did sort of need that here. Especially when you consider how condensed everything is here. I don't even think Dracula is in this film more than 10 minutes, or probably more than 10 minutes, but you have the shortest, most condensed Dracula story imaginable. The whole entirety of Dracula finding this woman and seducing her is like supposed to take place in the course of like an hour. I mean, you'd need him to be charming and romantic and fascinating in some way. One thing I will say about Carradine is that he does have really expressive eyes, which I think do well for the part. There's a great scene in this film where he turns into the bat, and it's the one that kind of seems the least awkward in terms of mixing the special effects with everything. You know, he is spooky, and like his eyes bulge out, and it just kind of looks like there's a lot of anger and lust there, and that's what you want in a Dracula. It's just you wish that there would have been more. And so, you know, you can't really fault the film too much, because this movie isn't about adding to the monster mythos. Like, pretty much everything that was wanted to be said about these monsters, or, you know, to create scares around them, had been done by this point. And you really couldn't add a whole lot more, as we're going to see later on with even the Wolfman and Frankenstein, who are the more popular monsters in this picture. But, this is really a greatest hits compilation, I'd like to say. It gives the public what they want. Well, maybe not necessarily, because you don't have Dracula, played by Lugosi. Here we're about to see how stupid this Dracula is. He goes and kills the Burgomaster because Niemann promises him that he'll always have a safe haven for his coffin, but, you know, at the first sign of trouble, which is probably less than 4 hours after they first met Dracula, they throw the coffin out the window. I like the look on Carradine's face. I'm like, oh, damn. This is a really awkward transition from day to night, but it works in this, you know, the movie magic kind of way. I really like it. You know, like, obviously they didn't film this shot at night, so there's kind of the filter over everything outdoors. You know, you see the light coming in on through the trees, and I really like this. It comes up really abruptly, and Carradine is moving over the coffin, and you see the glove on his hand, the riding glove, start to change into the skeleton hand. It's really good stuff. It's one of the most fun moments in the film. I don't want to say it's one of the most poignant, but there's Dracula for you. They got rid of him really fast, and the world is better for it. They do more with Dracula in House of Dracula, which is the sequel to this, and Carradine comes back, and he gets more screen time, and it's really less of a thankless role. You know, he gets to do more with the character, I think. Here we have Dr. Niemann and Daniel cart into the town of Frankenstein, where the last film supposedly took place. And, you know, you're gonna probably hear me complain about continuity again, just because I'm such a dang old nerd, but if we really want to get into it, the last film, was in Visaria. And as we saw, which was quite clear with Vozick, the old innkeeper, is that they hated Frankenstein and the influence that he had in the town. And at this point, we're supposed to believe that they decided to change the name of the town to Frankenstein. I think at this point, Universal just figured, or the screenwriter maybe hadn't even seen the other ones, because this isn't Kurt Siodmak writing this film. He just figured, that people just probably would have forgotten. Or maybe they think that the whole thing was the original Frankenstein, maybe played by Colin Clive, that they figured that people just didn't remember at this point. And that's one of the fun things about, new audiences discovering this film. I remember that always kind of annoyed me as a kid, because Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman was my favorite movie. And you see like a lackluster sequel that doesn't quite have the respect for the predecessor. But, here we have the gypsies again, like old Maliva. And we have the romantic interest of the film. And she's Alanka, who is played by Elena Verdugo, I believe her name is. And she is still with us, if I remember right. She, she was in a biography episode of Lon Chaney Jr., which was actually pretty interesting. Like, she kind of goes into the her experiences with Lon Chaney Jr. And I always like that she's pretty interesting in what she says about him. Like, she apparently Lon Jr. told her the story about how he changed his name from Creighton, his birth name, to Lon Jr., about kind of the frustration he had and about living in his father's shadow. And she had a lot of nice things to say about Lon Jr., which isn't, the consensus about it. But I believe she used to do some conventions. I don't know if she still does, because she must be pretty old by now, like almost 90. But it's always nice to know that, I don't know. It's nice to think that, there's still, at least as of right now, some people who have a connection to these films. Here we have a huge subplot of the film coming to life, where Daniel defies his master to save Alanka from the gypsy master who whips her. And this is actually, surprisingly, this subplot is pretty touching. Here we have my most favorite scene in the film, because it really reminds me about what I love about these monster films, particularly the Frankenstein films, and sort of the Lon Chaney, definitely Lon Chaney Sr. films, where Daniel here is offering Alanka some coffee, or some tea actually, and she can't see him and how ugly he is because of his hunchback. And I love the look on J. Carol Nash's face when she sees how repulsed when she sees how repulsed he is by his appearance. you feel so bad for him at this point. When he said, he says how lonely he is. This is he's an interesting character, Daniel. I really like him a lot. J. Carroll Naish doesn't play him as kind of like a simpleton, even though there's some of the dialogue here that sort of makes him seem a little dumb. But he plays him as very shy and very awkward, and very much in need of a friend. And, there's an interesting dynamic in his relationship with Professor Niemann in that, he sees this and that he exploits it in Daniel's brute strength. And later on we're going to find out how horrified Daniel becomes at the notion of what he's all done, because he wanted a friend and he was exploited. But these kind of moments are really what I love about these films, because there's always, in the best of these horror films like Frankenstein or The Phantom of the Opera or The Hunchback of Notre Dame or just any of the classic Lon Chaney pictures, is that, it's always an unrequited love story like that. And that the monster is really kind of how society looks at people, and how being lonely and ugly and forgotten kind of, although it, it doesn't measure a man, and although it can make someone angry and vengeful, it isn't what defines the person, the ugliness. Friend Daniel, I'll make you an Adonis. I like that line, and I like Karloff's delivery of it. I like Karloff's humorous moments. In the best of the pictures, he sort of has a black sense of humor, and there's some good moments in this film here. That moment, and I like in the beginning how Karloff sort of, like we said, how he plays the part of the sideshow owner. Here we have like the second or third time they've made a big deal about the Frankenstein records, his diaries about life and death. And really by this point it probably should have been destroyed, but every scientist needs to follow in Frankenstein's footsteps, so they need the records. And it's a convenient plot thing because it gets them where they need to be. We're about to be introduced to the monster and the Wolfman. They're both frozen in ice. That's a pretty terrifying image of the Wolfman there, clawing at his frozen prison. And there's the monster. The triumphant climax of Frankenstein's genius and the Wolfman. Like that's the second lesser note. Oh man. The monster here is played by Glenn Strange. We're gonna see him be unmelted in a little bit. There's the Wolfman coming out, and he's still stuck in his transformation, frozen in time from the end of Frankenstein meets the Wolfman. But Glenn Strange is an interesting character because he could be considered, a lot of people really like his interpretation of the monster, and I say that really kind of loosely, that he has an interpretation of the monster, because I really don't think he does. Glenn Strange, by this point in time, the monster, for lack of a better term, had kind of become nothing more than a prop. You'll see in this film that Neiman finds him and says, oh, his condition's deteriorating rapidly, we need to bring him back to life. And so he falls on the, they keep him on a lab operating table for the rest of the film. And it just kind of gets sad, really, because you see here, Karloff is in this picture, and you see that this character that Karloff had put his heart and soul in, and that you see in the original James Whale Frankenstein, how much acting talent it took to play that role. You know what I mean? That monster had so much soul, and now you see that. I don't want to say anything bad about Glenn Strange, because I'm sure he was a decent actor, and I just don't like bad-mouthing actors all that much, because I know kind of what it takes to get into a character. But Glenn Strange is really just an over-glorified stuntman. And you know what? It's disappointing, because Karloff's prophecy about the monster becoming nothing more than a lab lurch comes exactly true, and Karloff has to see it himself. Karloff, didn't really, I don't know if he flat out said he didn't care working on this picture, but I kind of am led to believe that in some ways. You know what I mean? Some interviews with Karloff later in his life, or around this time, right after he made this picture, House of Frankenstein, and another film for Universal called The Climax, he left Universal, who had really been his life source for so long. They gave him his career, his success, his niche. He left them because he felt that the films weren't doing anything. He just felt that they were doing the same stuff over and over again. So he went to Val Lewton, and RKO, which were extremely successful horror films. They're all very good. The Body Snatcher, Isle of the Dead, and Bedlam, which is my personal favorite of the three. But he would say that Val Lewton saved him from doing pictures like this. And I sort of infer that his distaste, or his supposed distaste for this picture, was about seeing his old friend reduced to this. And here's something I will say positive about Glenn Strange. He seriously damaged his tissues. One thing I really like about Glenn Strange's performance is, or not really his performance, just kind of the aesthetics of the character. He really looks great in that makeup. And I think that's kind of what draws people to that role. Supposedly the story is that Jack Pierce, the famous makeup man who created the looks for all this monster, was doing some character makeup on Glenn Strange for another picture. And he saw Glenn Strange and was, looking at him and sort of seeing the similarities to Karloff in his face, or, just kind of how his face was molded. And he said, to Glenn Strange, if you stay late tonight, I'll do a makeup test on you that might get you to another part and get you some money. And so, Glenn Strange, of course, said, yeah, and he, hit all the mirrors and, made him up as the Frankenstein monster. And then we showed him, he said, oh, I look just like Boris Karloff. And that's a cute story. And, that's the appeal of Glenn Strange's monster. He looks really good in this, as the monster in this film. And here we have Larry Talbot, Lon Chaney Jr., who I haven't talked about yet, who really, I think the character suffers because he was in a far superior interpretation of the character, in a far superior film above this one, Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. His motivations in that film, his want to die was so very strong. Just everything after it that they could come up here just kind of pales in comparison. And, just you feel so sorry for Larry in that film. And, that's really is what you want. I mean, what you want from the character is for him to have that final ending, and that would have been a good final ending. And I'm not faulting Universal for bringing back the character, obviously, but I think it would have made the character stronger had they given him some other motivation, or maybe had Lon Jr.'s character be more into this love story here. Alanka loves Larry, but Larry is just not into her at all. I think it would have been interesting. I think the character would have been more compelling had the love story been a little stronger, and Larry, was fearful of harming Alanka, like in the original Wolfman with Evelyn Ankers, because that story works really, really well, because they are a believable couple and they very much love each other. And you don't see that happy-go-lucky Lon Jr. From the original one. And that's part of Lon Jr.'s original charm, is that he was a happy guy, in the original Wolfman. And he's a very likable guy. And that's why the character of the Wolfman is so interesting and so sad. And I don't think Lon Jr. does a bad job in this film. I just think he's really just rehashing the material. I think he also fares better in Frankenstein, or the next, not Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, the next film, House of Dracula, because it brings the character to a conclusion. This kind of just feels kind of anticlimactic in a lot of ways. And, just looking at this, this wouldn't have been a very good ending for the character had this film been the last version of the character. The moon will be full tonight. You know what that means? One thing that they do really improve upon here is not only the Wolfman makeup, because that improved with each film. This is probably the best the Wolfman has ever looked, because they sort of limit it in the next one. But this is the pinnacle of it. But also the transformation sequence is so incredible in this movie, because you actually see the Wolfman in front of a mirror, and you see kind of more ferociousness. You see the change from Larry Talbot, who is so frightened, and as he becomes the Wolfman, this violent animal. You see it in the eyes, particularly, and sort of the mouth too. It's really good, mixing that makeup, and it shows kind of how the technology improved between the pictures. Dr. Niemann. Here we have Dr. Niemann finally getting through his revenge, and for how good Karloff is in this picture, another thing that's sort of limiting it is how silly this kind of revenge plan is, because, I don't know, maybe you're just going to say, hey, Mike, you're just going into the continuity bitching again, and, maybe it is. But Niemann's plan is to play brain swap with these guys and put their brains in the skull of the monster and the Wolfman to curse them. But, we saw in the last film, what we saw in the last film, or not the last one, Ghost of Frankenstein, that the whole brain transplant doesn't work the way that it works in this film. Igor kept his consciousness as it was put into the monster, and so you'd have to assume that you're just putting Larry's, everyone would keep their consciousness, and supposedly that Larry would have his lycanthropy intact. I'm gonna give that brain of yours a new home. See, he changes the whole. He changes the whole mechanics of how it's worked. He tells the one guy he's gonna put his brain in the skull of the Frankenstein monster, and then the other guy says he's going to give the brain of the Wolfman to. How does that work? Will the one guy live life as the monster, but then if he puts the werewolf or the Wolfman's brain in the other guy, wouldn't he just not have his own consciousness anymore? I've wasted time there. How goofy is that? And he wants to put the monster's brain in Talbot's body. He says it's the perfect body for it. That's so goofy. Here's Daniel, and he realizes how he's been exploited, and how the promise of being able to help him and bring him out of his hunchback body is how he's been egging him on, and that he probably has no intention to help him. You love him, don't you? Oh boy, Lon Chaney Jr. is he's not and he's not an ugly man by any means, but it's really kind of hard to believe that she is so smitten with him. Yeah, no, I'd believe it in the original Wolfman, because he's sort of fun and he's got a very inviting personality in that movie, but this incantation of the character is just really depressed. Oh, you feel so badly for Daniel here, because she she eventually does come to realize that he's telling the truth, but she screams at Daniel and calls him an ugly hunchback and a vile thing, and that she hates him. And you just really feel bad for poor Daniel. That's a pretty sad scene, and I love this here. Daniel takes the whip to the monster because he is the source of all their trouble. You know, even this kind of becomes a recurring theme in all these Monster Mash pictures, is that the monster, you know, represents the temptation of the scientist from doing the work that you want them to do. Like Dr. Manning in the last one, even though he's very different from Neiman, he's a good man. Like, he becomes so interested in the physics of the monster, and then in this one you see Daniel have to outweight Neiman finishing his experiments with the monster, and Talbot too, again here. Oh boy, this is a good one too. A good transformation. You see the footprints follow him, and they turn into paws as they go along. Yeah. Like I was saying, this is a film directed by Earl Kenton, who did Ghost of Frankenstein, and he made a really good horror film called Island of Lost Souls. But that was like a whole generation before this. It was in the early 30s. But these films just really, they don't have a distinct personality to them. I'm not saying they're poorly directed, but they don't have a visual style. They're really held up by the acting and the makeup effects, and he's really fortunate to have Boris Karloff and Lon Chaney Jr. headline this picture, because there isn't really a personality to this film. Like, the beginning of it is really good. It's very macabre. There's atmosphere with the rain and the lighting here, but everything else is just kind of point and shoot in some ways. Here's the first instance in the series where someone's throat is ripped out and they blame it on a werewolf right away. You know, as we saw in the Wolfman and Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, is that everyone needed a hell of a lot of convincing for them to believe in an actual werewolf. They all thought it was the real deal, a wild animal. And it's kind of funny to see them finally come to realize that, hey, maybe a werewolf is conceivable. Yeah, here we see that the last scene was kind of pointless because she goes to see Larry, who conveniently is just kind of walking around angsty. Oh, man. It's the one scene where we see Larry sort of reciprocate her love. Oh, but I did. I wanted to kill. See, this is an interesting thing that they really didn't do before this. I like the fact that they sort of play, you know, even if it's sort of subtle like it is here, the fact that, you know, Larry Talbot is a good man, and he's a cursed man who wants nothing like this. But then they sort of say, you know, he says while he's in that curse that he wants to kill. And I always sort of liked that aspect of the lycanthropy myth with werewolves. You know, the whole the whole idea that, werewolves represent the evil side of man, that that primal animal in all man. It's the outlet for it to come out, that every man has this evil side. And I really like that. And it's good that this is it's like, I like Chaney's delivery of the line, and it is the first version of it. And it's done better in some other films, but, to see the master werewolf do it is really fun. Here we have the silver being brought into it. And, in every film they try to, compensate for or not everyone, but they try to, bring some finality to how they kill the werewolf. And by this point you have to believe that, that this wouldn't be enough to kill him, because in the original one, he's killed by someone he loves with a silver bullet, or not a silver bullet, but with silver. His father kills him with the silver-tipped cane, and I think would have been interesting to see if Dr. Manning's assisted suicide in the last film would have worked better from Dr. Frankenstein's notes. But, you can't keep a good monster down, so why try to explain it? Why try to even guess? I like in the next film that he goes to Dr. Dr. Edelman in the House of Dracula. And he has the request to just cure me of it all. Don't brain transplant me. Don't what the heck? Assist with my suicide. Don't play with silver. Just cure me. And I love the fact that he's cured in the next film, because he really does deserve it. He really deserves it, and I wish that, you could have, maybe seen him get married and live happily ever after, but he doesn't get to. You see him later on in the next film, in the next film after House of Dracula, which isn't really a part of the series. Abbott and Costello Frankenstein, he's got his lycanthropy intact again. And it's played for some good laughs. Oh, here's the first look at Glenn Strange as the monster. He's being brought to life. I like the fact that they're early for the werewolf. They're early for him, I guess. I initially thought that, like they had lit the torches or just kind of stayed there, but I guess they were hunting for the werewolf. And they actually believe it's a werewolf. Well, good for them. They're smarter this time around. Kind of the lab equipment is a lot less impressive than it's been before. But to be fair to Earl Kent, he does a good job with the close-ups of the equipment and sort of seeing the sparks fly. Those are always fun shots, good tropes that you like to see in a Frankenstein picture. Here's the monster finally brought to life. And he sort of he doesn't even talk, really. He just sort of looks at him. And he kind of likes Neiman as his friend, I guess, because he brought him back to life. But, apparently, I don't know how true the story is, but like in the press publicity for this film, they would say that, Glenn Strange is playing the monster, but he has like the original monster Karloff on the set, and so Karloff supposedly gave Glenn Strange pointers and direction on how to successfully play the monster. And you don't always see it, because really the monster only has one scene where he's up and walking about. But I sort of see it in how he uses his hands, because Karloff was very good at using his hands as the monster, kind of the stiffness in him, and he would use it as an animal. Like, you remember the scene where Dwight Fry's Fritz was torturing the monster with the fire, and how Karloff would shriek and, wave his hands real sternly against it. And I sort of see that with Glenn Strange here, but otherwise, like I said, you don't really get a feel for Glenn Strange adding any personality to the monster. Here we have this great transformation sequence, and you look at Lon Chaney Jr.'s eyes. He really does a good job here in kind of showcasing how violent the monster becomes. Look at how wide they are there. They don't even look real. And that makeup is terrific. And, this is the only scene the Wolfman gets in the film, because he isn't really in the film all that much. You saw last time him just running away, and all the murders happen off camera. And all you see here is him attack her, and he gets shot and runs off. This isn't really a film about the quantity of the monsters. It's just kind of about how fun it is to see them all in one picture again. And so it's really kind of just a film only about marquee value. But, it's better than that. Even though we don't have very much of any monster, really. It's just, I guess, thinking about it, the actual Wolfman is in it about the same amount of time as Glenn Strange's monster. I guess, because Chaney is so into it, has so much fun with the role, he's got that ferociousness that you just, he leaves more of an impression than Glenn Strange's monster to me. Oh, boy. She dies in the arms, and poor Daniel sees it. Now we're about to enter the finale of the film, where the monster comes to life. And the villagers come to punish him. Oh. This is the first film where he's referred to as the Wolfman. They actually refer to him as the Wolfman. It's like that they actually read the movie reviews. That's a good scene, seeing Karloff being strangled by Daniel from the shadows. That is a good scene. I give credit where credit's due, particularly that there. You see the Karloff's big bushy hair fall down. And the monster comes to punish Daniel for what he did. Listen to this here. This is blatant sound recycling. And I didn't notice until it was actually pointed out. But that scream is actually Boris Karloff screaming from Son of Frankenstein, when he dies and falls into the sulfur pit at the end of that film. Glenn Strange, for all the knack or criticism that Bela Lugosi's interpretation of the monster in Frankenstein meets the Wolfman gets, Glenn Strange seems to be borrowing a great deal from that version of the character. Kind of his outstretched arms like that, how stiff he moves. It's very much reminiscent of, I think, Lugosi's version of the character. Oh, there he's making a little noise, the monster. I didn't ever think he vocalized anything, but he does sort of sound like Karloff, so maybe the old guy did teach him a few things. You know, speaking of kind of just looking at these films and dissecting them, apparently there's some moments here where Lon Jr. filled in, or at least Lon Jr. claimed to fill in for Glenn Strange and what into the monster makeup, and I was trying to look for them the last time I saw the film. There's one moment where he looks a little fatter and bloated, more bloated than usual, but I don't know if we'll ever find it. Another endorsement as the film ends to the classic monster movie board, which is always a fascinating read. A lot of great fans there, and they really loved this film and discussing it, and it's surely an entertaining movie, even though it is pretty flawed. And Glenn Strange's monster lasts, I don't know, like 20 minutes he lives? Even worse than Carradine's Dracula. And poor Neiman is pulled into the quicksand to fall to a death. That's the end, a universal picture. And I am going to shut off this glorious VHS. It has been an entertaining film, and it was a pleasure to show it and watch it with you. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I appreciate all the likes that Frankenstein meets the Wolfman commentary received, and I hope you guys like this one too. I don't know what will be next, but I really had a good time doing this one, and I'd imagine that we'll see some monsters in the future. Hopefully you guys will be back next time, and the monsters will never die. Have a pleasant evening, and thanks for listening.